5,000 artifacts. That number stopped me cold. Not the location, not the century, the number. Because 5,000 objects don't wash ashore. They don't accumulate by accident. 5,000 artifacts, recovered from a continent that Western civilization officially discovered in 1820, represents something that the standard historical timeline simply cannot absorb without cracking at the seams. And yet there they were, cataloged, classified, and in several documented cases, quietly removed from public academic discourse before most people ever had a chance to ask a single question. I found this while researching something else entirely. I was tracing the supply chain logistics of early 19th century polar expeditions, looking for discrepancies in manifest records, when a footnote in a British Admiralty shipping log from 1842 referenced a cargo transfer I couldn't explain. Crates, marked with a classification code used by the Royal Geographical Society for sensitive recovered materials. Destination: a private storage annex in Portsmouth that no longer exists. The crates are not mentioned again. That footnote sent me down 18 months of research. What I found doesn't give me answers. It gives me a pattern. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Antarctica is the size of the United States and Mexico combined. It sits beneath nearly 2 miles of ice on average. It is, by every modern account, one of the most inhospitable environments ever to exist on this planet. A place where exposed skin freezes in minutes, and where the wind can exceed 200 miles per hour. The official story of human contact with Antarctica begins in 1820, when 3 separate expeditions, British, Russian, and American, independently claimed to have sighted the continent within months of each other. The timing is almost theatrical. Before 1820, according to the accepted record, no human being had ever seen Antarctica. No foot had touched its shores. No hand had mapped its coastline. The continent existed only in geographic theory, referred to by ancient cartographers as Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, a philosophical placeholder more than a documented place. Let me be fair to the official narrative. The early 19th century was a golden age of exploration. Britain, Russia, and the nascent United States were in aggressive competition for geographic dominance. The Southern Ocean was commercially valuable, rich in seal populations that drove a lucrative fur trade. It makes complete historical sense that multiple nations would independently push southward in the same decade, driven by the same commercial and nationalistic pressures. The discovery of Antarctica fits neatly into the broader story of imperial expansion. Historians have documented these expeditions thoroughly. The logs exist. The captains are named. And yet, let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are where this stops making sense. The official recovery of what researchers and polar archaeologists now collectively refer to as the Antarctic artifact assemblage did not happen in a single dramatic expedition. It happened across a 30-year window between approximately 1820 and 1850, during which 7 separate national expeditions, British, American, French, Russian, Norwegian, and 2 private commercial ventures, returned from southern polar waters with what their own internal record described as anomalous recovered objects. 7 expeditions, across 6 nations, all finding the same category of thing. The objects themselves range enormously in type. What has been confirmed through surviving institutional records, primarily housed today in fragmented collections at the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, the Smithsonian Institution's restricted archive in Washington, D.C., and the St. Petersburg State Museum of Arctic and Antarctic Exploration, includes worked stone tools, ceramic fragments with deliberate geometric incision patterns, iron implements of uncertain manufacture date, textile remnants woven in techniques that polar researchers in the 1960s struggled to classify, and in at least 11 documented instances, carved objects that appear to represent deliberate artistic expression. Not functional tools, not accidental deposits. Art. The part that keeps me up at night is not what was found. If it was written about it internally and then not written about it publicly. Speaking of internal records, there's a communication gap that I cannot explain away. In 1839, French explorer Jules Dumont d'Urville led an expedition that planted the French flag on Antarctic ice and named a coastal region Adélie Land after his wife. The voyage is thoroughly documented. D'Urville was a meticulous record keeper, and his published account, Voyage au pôle sud dans l'Océanie, runs to multiple volumes. It is taught in French naval history courses to this day. What is not in the published account, but is referenced obliquely in 3 of D'Urville's private letters held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, is a landing party encounter that he describes in personal correspondence as objects of clear human manufacture, the origin of which I cannot, in conscience, attribute to any known civilization. 3 private letters, written to colleagues, never published. D'Urville died in 1842 in a railway accident near Versailles, one of the first major railway disasters in French history. His private research papers were consolidated by the French Navy and partially transferred to institutional custody. A portion of those papers, according to a 1971 catalog audit by the Bibliothèque Nationale, is listed as transferred, location unconfirmed. That's not a filing error. That's a gap. Which brings me to the American side of this pattern, because the gap deepens considerably when you cross the Atlantic. The United States Exploring Expedition of 1838 to 1842, known informally as the Wilkes Expedition after its commander, Lieutenant Charles Wilkes, is one of the most consequential and most contested scientific voyages in American history. Wilkes circumnavigated Antarctica, confirmed it was a continent rather than a collection of islands, collected thousands of specimens, and returned to the United States with material that became the founding collection of what would eventually become the Smithsonian Institution. The expedition's scientific results were published across 19 volumes, an enormous, celebrated achievement of early American science. Geology, botany, ethnography, meteorology, cartography, 19 volumes. There should have been a 20th. In the correspondence archive of James Dwight Dana, the expedition's primary geologist, whose papers are held at Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library, there are references to a planned volume on anomalous material culture recovered from southern polar regions. Dana mentions this volume in at least 4 letters between 1843 and 1847. He describes working with Wilkes on the classification framework. He describes receiving specimens for analysis. The volume was never published. Dana's letters stop referencing it entirely after December 1847. There is no explanation for the discontinuation. No replacement volume. No published paper summarizing the findings. The specimens Dana references are not cataloged in any surviving Smithsonian inventory from that period. Maybe the project was simply abandoned. Academic projects fail. Funding dries up. Priorities shift. Maybe. But Dana was not a man who abandoned projects quietly. His published record spans 5 decades of continuous scientific output. He wrote about nearly everything else from the Wilkes expedition in exhaustive detail. He never wrote a single published word about what he found in the southern polar material. The timeline isn't subtle. I want to be precise about the nature of these artifacts, because precision matters when the instinct is to reach for dramatic conclusions. The ceramic fragments, and this is where the pattern becomes most difficult to explain, were subjected to analysis in at least 3 documented instances during the 19th century. The earliest analysis I can trace was conducted in 1851 at the Royal Institution in London, commissioned through a private arrangement whose principal funder is listed in institutional ledgers only as a fellow of the society. The analysis determined that the ceramic composition included clay mineral signatures inconsistent with any known Antarctic geological formation. The clay had to come from somewhere else. It was brought there. Someone carried ceramic objects, fired pottery, to Antarctica. The secondary analysis occurred in 1869, conducted by a Norwegian natural historian named Christopher Blom. working from fragments recovered by the sealing vessel Håkon in 1831. Blom published a brief paper in a Norwegian scientific journal suggesting the fragments represented evidence of pre-modern human activity in southern latitudes. The paper attracted almost no attention. Blom died in 1871. His collection was donated to the University of Christiania, now the University of Oslo, where 1998 inventory found that the Antarctic-related specimens had been reclassified and stored in a non-public research archive, accessible only by institutional petition. The third analysis is the most recent and the most striking. In 1962, a joint American-British research team at McMurdo Station conducted a materials analysis of 11 objects recovered during a routine glaciological survey near the Transantarctic Mountains. The analysis was conducted under the auspices of the International Geophysical Year follow-up program. Their findings, which I accessed through a declassified National Science Foundation document obtained via Freedom of Information request, noted worked iron content inconsistent with natural deposition and geometric surface modifications suggesting intentional manufacture. The report was classified as internal research record and not submitted for peer review. Not classified secret, not destroyed, simply never submitted, left sitting in a filing cabinet for 40 years before declassification procedures made it accessible. That's not suppression. That's something quieter and in some ways more unsettling. That's institutional silence. Let's talk about the ice because the ice changes the question entirely. Antarctica's ice sheet is not a static object. It moves. It grows and retreats across geological time. During periods known as interglacials, warm phases between ice ages, significant portions of the Antarctic coastline that are today buried under kilometers of ice were, in fact, exposed land. The last major interglacial period peaked approximately 120,000 years ago, but there were subsequent periods of reduced ice coverage that Antarctic glaciologists continue to study and debate. Here is where the chronology becomes genuinely complicated. The Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513 by Ottoman Admiral Haji Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, and held today at the Topkapi Palace Museum Library in Istanbul, depicts a southern landmass with coastal features that a number of cartographic researchers, most prominently Captain Lorenzo Burrows of the U.S. Air Force in a 1960 analysis, argued corresponded to the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica. Not the ice surface, the land beneath the ice, as later revealed by a seismic survey. The official explanation is that Piri Reis was aggregating older, inaccurate source maps, and that any resemblance to Antarctic topography is coincidental. That explanation is entirely reasonable. It is also impossible to definitively verify, because Piri Reis himself noted in his own annotations that he compiled his map from about 20 charts and Mappe Mundi, source documents he wrote that dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. We do not have those source documents. They are gone, which brings me to the 1,500-year problem, because it sits directly at the center of everything I've been describing. If pre-modern human beings, whether we're speaking of ancient Phoenician navigators, lost Polynesian voyagers pushing far beyond their documented range, or members of civilization that our current historical framework hasn't yet identified, if any of these peoples reached Antarctic waters and deposited material culture on those shores, the physical evidence would behave in a specific way. Objects left on exposed Antarctic land would, over centuries, become incorporated into advancing glacial ice. They would be carried, slowly, grinding across rock. Some would be destroyed, but ceramics, worked stone, and certain metal compositions are extraordinarily durable under cold, dry conditions. They could survive. They could, under the right geological circumstances, be deposited back onto coastal surfaces as glaciers calved and retreated. This is not speculative physics. This is documented glaciological mechanics. What it means, in practical terms, is that an artifact found on an Antarctic shore in 1831 by a Norwegian sealing crew does not necessarily date to 1831 or to any period remotely close to 1831. It could be centuries old. It could be far older than that. And no one, not a single published scientific paper from the 19th century, not a single official expedition report, attempted to date the Antarctic recovered objects using any methodology more rigorous than visual inspection. They looked at the objects. They categorized them by appearance. And then, in case after case after case, they put them away. Maybe that reflects the genuine limitations of 19th century science. Radiometric dating didn't exist. Analytical chemistry was in its infancy. Researchers couldn't have known what they were looking at in any precise chronological sense. Maybe, but they knew enough to recognize that what they were looking at didn't fit. D'Urville knew. Dana knew. Blom knew. They said so in letters and private notes and cautiously worded journal entries. They just never said so publicly. The question I keep returning to is not who made these objects, or when, or how they reached the bottom of the world. Those are fascinating questions. They're also questions I genuinely cannot answer, and I won't pretend otherwise. The question I keep returning to is simpler and, in some ways, darker. Why, across 7 expeditions, spanning 6 nations, across 3 decades of the 19th century, did the people who found these objects, scientists, naval officers, men whose professional reputations depended on accurate documentation, why did they consistently choose institutional silence over scientific publication? What did they think they were protecting? There's a pattern here that repeats with an almost rhythmic consistency. Object found. Object analyzed privately. Analysis not published. Object reclassified or transferred. Paper trail ends. That's not the behavior of men who thought they'd found something insignificant. That's the behavior of men who understood, with whatever conceptual framework their era provided, that what they had found was going to require the dismantling of something large, something load-bearing. The entire structure of 19th century civilization rested on a particular story about human progress, a linear, ascending narrative in which modern European civilization represented the apex of human achievement, and all prior history was a sequence of lesser, simpler stages leading inevitably upward. Into that framework, evidence of sophisticated pre-modern human presence in the most remote location on Earth does not fit. It does not merely challenge the narrative. It detonates it. I want to come back to the 5,000 number because I haven't yet explained where it comes from, and that explanation matters. The figure of approximately 5,000 objects is not derived from a single source. It is a composite estimate, assembled from 4 separate archival streams. The first is a partial inventory document from the Scott Polar Research Institute, dated 1934, which references aggregate holdings from multiple 19th century expeditions described as material culture, southern polar origin, provenance, uncertain. The second is a correspondence thread between 2 Smithsonian curators in 1923, discussing the consolidation of pre-1900 Antarctic recovered material into a unified storage protocol, a thread that references a quantity of objects that, when described proportionally to available storage, suggests a collection of significant scale. The third is a Norwegian museum inventory from 1908 that catalogs Blom's collection alongside several other smaller private donations, all described with the same unusual classification note. Origin disputed, Antarctic region. The fourth is the 1962 NSF document I referenced earlier, which itself refers back to a 1950 internal review of all Antarctic recovered material currently held in institutional custody across signatory nations of the International Geophysical Year Framework. That 1950 review estimated the total institutional holdings at not fewer than 4,000 individual specimens, with significant additional material in private collections or of unconfirmed current location. 4,000 confirmed. Significant additional material unconfirmed. 5,000 is a conservative reading of those numbers. The real figure may be higher, and most of those objects have never been publicly exhibited, never been the subject of a peer-reviewed paper, never been submitted to the kind of systematic modern analysis, isotopic dating, compositional spectroscopy, three-dimensional geometric morphometrics that could actually tell us something definitive about what we're looking at. They are sitting, right now, in restricted institutional storage, in Cambridge and Washington and Oslo and St. Petersburg. Waiting. I don't have answers, only patterns. The pattern says that multiple independent national expeditions, operating without coordination, found the same category of anomalous material in the same region and responded in the same way, with private documentation and public silence. The pattern says that the institutional systems designed to preserve and share scientific knowledge made, in these specific cases, a different choice. The pattern says that 5,000 objects, representing potential evidence of pre-modern human presence at the bottom of the world, are today more inaccessible to public scientific scrutiny than they were in 1850. Maybe I'm seeing connections where none exist. Maybe the silence was scientific caution rather than concealment. Maybe the objects are exactly what the official silence implies: anomalous geological formations misidentified by 19th century observers who lacked the scientific framework to know better. Maybe, but D'Urville didn't think he was looking at geology. He said so in his letters. Dana didn't think he was looking at geology. He built an entire unpublished volume around what he found. The Norwegian researchers, the British analysts, the American glaciologists who filed a report and then let it sit for 4 decades. None of them responded the way scientists respond to things that don't matter. They responded the way people respond when something matters too much. The artifacts are still there. In some cases, the documentation is still there. The Bibliothèque Nationale still holds D'Urville's correspondence. The Beinecke still holds Dana's letters. The NSF document is declassified and accessible to anyone with the patience to file a request. The story isn't gone. It's just never been told in sequence. And once you see the sequence, you start to wonder what else has been filed away. What other footnotes are sitting in shipping logs and private letters and institutional inventories, waiting for someone to read them in order. I spent 18 months following a footnote in a British Admiralty record about crates that arrived in Portsmouth and were never mentioned again. I still don't know what was in those crates, but I know what I think, and I think you do too.